Hello class, today's video lesson we're going to be talking about heat energy. We have previously talked a little bit about heat energy when we were talking about forms of energy. Now we're going to explore that in more detail. In today's lesson we're going to be looking at the ways that heat can be transferred through matter by the collisions of atoms, conduction, or through space, radiation, in a liquid or gas. Currents will facilitate the transfer of heat, convection. The essential question that we will be addressing in this lesson is explain how heat is transferred when you use a microwave, an oven, and a stovetop to cook food. And in all three of those examples, we would be able to see conduction, convection, and radiation. Your I can statement, I can describe how heat is transferred by conduction, convection, and radiation. Please make sure you write this statement on your student-friendly standards sheet in your notebook. Let's look at this visual here on the screen. In this visual, you can see the three ways that heat is transferred. You've got convection, conduction, and radiation. Now, what we're going to explore in this lesson is being able to explain how is this conduction, how does this show radiation, and how does this show convection. And hopefully by the end of the video lesson, this will be much clearer to you. Let's first talk about conduction. Conduction is one of the easier types of heat transfer to identify. Conduction is going to occur when particles in a material collide with neighboring particles, which basically means that those particles are going to be, or those objects are going to be in direct contact. You have two items that will be touching, and when those objects are touching, heat will be transferred. Conduction is going to occur most easily in solids and liquids, where your atoms and molecules are closer together. An example of conduction would be if I'm holding an ice cube in my hand and it starts to melt. The heat would be transferred from my hand to the ice cube, causing it to start melting. That would be what we would call conduction. Or if you took a spoon and you put it in a warm cup of soup, and that spoon will eventually start to warm up, that's because of conduction. So conduction is when you have two objects that are in direct contact or touching each other and heat gets transferred. Convection. Convection is one of the ones that's a little bit harder for us to kind of visualize. It happens in your liquids and gases. What happens with convection is when you have a transfer or a movement of atoms or molecules from one part of a material to another part. What we mean by that is, look at this example of this water boiling in this pot. When you start to add heat to this water, the particles that make up the water are going to start moving to different locations. The warmer particles, as you can see, they rise. They're going to go up. As they cool back down, then they're going to sink back down to the bottom. And so what you have in here is a cycle, and you're going to have this cycle is going to continue until all this water is at the same temperature. Another example that you could use for convection would be air. When you warm air in a room, you're going to have the warmer air is going to rise up towards the ceilings of the room, and then the cooler air is towards the bottom. And that's what we call convection. And it happens in liquids and gases because those are the particles those are the states of matter where the particles are more spread out. And convection is a movement of atoms or molecules from one part of a material to another part of a material. Radiation. Radiation is going to occur when heat is transferred by some special waves that we call electromagnetic waves. And these are waves that can carry energy through empty space as well as through matter. And we're going to have an individual lesson on these types of waves a little bit later in the year. But these are the special waves that make radiation possible. The transfer of thermal energy by radiation can occur in empty space. And with radiation, radiation can occur with solids, liquids, or gases. So it can occur in all three states of matter. A perfect example of radiation is when the sun warms the Earth's surface. That would be an example of radiation. If I'm sitting in front of a fireplace or a heater, and my body starts to get warm, that would also be because of radiation. So just think about with radiation is that it can happen in solids, liquids, or gases, and it can also be transferred by these special waves, which are what we call electromagnetic waves. And as we look at more examples of radiation in our lesson, you'll start to understand this one a little bit more as well. Another good example of radiation is if you were to hold your hand above a light bulb or a lamp, you may notice that your hand will start to get very warm. Well, that's because of radiation. You don't even have to touch it. Your hand doesn't even have to be extremely close to it, but that heat will eventually get to your hand because of the electromagnetic waves are carrying that thermal energy. Let's look at this visual. You can see all three types of heat transfer being shown in this particular visual. You've got radiation. He's sitting in front of this fire and his body is becoming warm. You've got conduction. He touches the stick and his hand gets burned. And then you've got convection. He turns the fan on, and you can see up here, this is where your warmer air is going to be, and then your cooler air would be at the bottom, okay? So radiation is transferred by electromagnetic waves. Conduction is transferred by direct contact. Convection is transferred by the movement of atoms and molecules from one place to another place. I want you to look at this last slide, and I want you to, just on a scratch sheet of paper, write down what type of heat transfer you think is occurring in each one of these examples, 1 through 5. I'm going to pause for a few seconds and give you a chance to do that, and then we will check our answers. Okay, class, if you set number one is conduction. That is heat transfer by direct contact. Number 2 would be radiation. Anytime the sun is warming a surface, that would be considered radiation. Number 3, the liquid in the test tube is warmed. You have to be careful with this one because actually you have both here. If you're talking about the flame in direct contact with the test tube, that will be conduction. But we're focusing on the liquid in the test tube being warmed. That's going to be an example of convection. Number 4 would also be another example of convection, and number 5 would be another example of convection as well. So you have all 3 examples shown here in these pictures. Please make sure that you have added some pictures to your foldable and your notes, and that concludes our lesson on heat transfer.